Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another screencast. This is just the day after our class, and I had a few things to fill in that we didn't get to, and then looking ahead a little bit as well. So here we go. So I know I talked a lot about John Hattie. I don't want to belabor that, but just to review a couple things from that, and I didn't quite finish everything that I wanted to talk about. Obviously, we did talk about his background and that sort of thing. And really, there were two big terms: meta-analysis, if you remember, and also effect size. So, again, a meta-analysis is just taking lots of research studies and putting them all together. So, I think I said if there's 100 studies on homework, what John Hattie did is he put all those studies into one, kind of came up with a mathematical way of looking at all those studies so that you got sort of a summary of all those studies and then came up with an effect size, sort of an average of all those studies. And we'll look at an effect size again briefly. So if we look at some of his work, you see it here. For instance, this number here, the higher the number, basically, the more effective it is. And collective teacher efficacy is by far the highest number, as you can see here in all these effect sizes. Again, tomorrow, as I mentioned, he's not tomorrow, well, maybe tomorrow, but next month he's coming out with a new visible learning book with all new data. Some of these numbers will go up and maybe some will go down, but there'll be also new categories too. Collective teacher efficacy, simply put, is the ability for teachers to work together. Probably more than likely in a professional learning community where you do common assessments, you talk curriculum together, you talk about best instructional practices. That seems to have the highest effect on academic achievement. And again, as you look at this, I would encourage you to do that. If you go all the way down to the bottom, I don't know why I'm looking at the bottom stuff, but here you have things like summer vacation is actually a downer, which makes sense, although not a big downer if you look. Negative 0.02 is not terrible, certainly. And yet, things like ADHD, deafness, boredom, depression. A couple things here. You'll notice military deployment is fairly low, so those families have to be careful. Retention, obviously pretty low. Corporal punishment in the home is pretty low as well, which really does make sense, doesn't it? All right, so the other thing I wanted to look at as far as Hattie, Corwin Publishers with John Hattie have put together this pretty amazing and maybe overwhelming website. It's called Visible Learning MetaX. And it takes, I think it's new data too. It takes what looks like 9 different categories and does effect size influence by these domains. So for instance, if you look at student learning strategies, which is kind of what we've been looking at, and you can index them by likely to have a negative impact. Let's go negative here. No content found. How about likely to have considerably positive impact? You can see that kids seeking help have a pretty high effect size of 0.72. Effort management, whatever the heck that is, 0.77. Again, you can click on any of these hyperlinks and they'll tell you more information. But it's not a bad site to look at once in a while as you're deciding as a teacher your best instructional practices. So that's a bit about John Hattie there. And you might even be able to use this in this class for some of your research for the AARP and even the literature review, which is coming up. All right, so a couple, just before we go from Hattie, a couple things to look at. This is fuzzy, but I wanted to show that, again, you have 4 different categories. Excuse me. 0.4, as I take a drink here. 0.4 is sort of the average effect size. So it's kind of the zero, really, the in the middle. And everything higher than that is a zone of desired effects, and lower is obviously not so great. So you see here, the decreased below or decreased achievement is the red here. That yellow is what is going to happen without schooling, just by kids growing older by a year, because kids do grow. They get their brains develop, and and they have some sort of influence on their brain, in addition to the physiological piece. And then this is the piece that sort of typical teacher effect that can be accomplished in a year of teaching. But the blue here, this is what you really want. And an easier way of looking at it is this, where you see they actually put in different effect categories where, again, collective teacher efficacy is at the highest, and then down from there all the way to summer vacation. And anything bigger than 0.4 really does accelerate student learning. It's better than average. So if you want a student, you could say, grow more than a year's growth in a year, you got to do the blue things. And that's the concept. More links here. If you ever want to look at them, I showed you this teacher clarity one already. You can see teacher clarity is definitely in a zone of desired effects. And then we talked about surprising results from remote learning, where really the effect size, the negative effect size, which makes sense, it was a little bit negative, obviously, was only about worldwide to negative 0.15, but in the U.S., negative 0.08. Actually, probably a lower negative effect than summer vacation even is. So why? We had more collective efficacy during COVID. We worked together more than we ever have, probably because we had to, and then we were more efficient as well. Okay, let's get into formative assessment a little bit, just as an introduction. We will spend the month doing that wonderful area. First, a quick review on where assessment lies within the context of understanding by design. This is something you might want to look at in more detail, but stage one, as we remember, is pretty much the curriculum piece. It's what do we want kids to know and be able to do? Or as the authors Grant and Jay might say, what is worthy and requiring of understanding, of student understanding, and that's stage one. Then when you're done with stage one, you don't even look at assessment yet. And one thing I think about is when I was a teacher, and perhaps more in the 80s, hopefully than the 90s, in my second half of my classroom career. At first, I really didn't think so much about varying my assessment. No matter what unit it was, no matter what I was teaching, I did maybe the same sort of things, quizzes, tests, writing assignments, projects. I did some formative assessment type projects, but I didn't vary it. I didn't look at the unit and what I was teaching and thinking, well, maybe I should do a different sort of assessment based on what I'm teaching. So stage two also asks you to vary the assessment. Don't do the same things all the time. And then, of course, stage three are the lesson plans. If we look at the 6 facets of understanding, when we look at UBD specifically, what the authors say is that we, as teachers, should look at the 6 facets to make sure, to ensure that we are doing more than the basic assessments. It's kind of a check. I've seen teachers have like the 6 facets, a chart like this, as well as, say, the DOK wheel up on their wall next to their desk as they're lesson planning. And so the 6 facets, real briefly, go like this. So explanation is kind of often what you think about. Can kids, as my assessment, can I ensure that kids understand because they were able to explain a topic? Am I sure that they understand my skills or content that I taught because they can interpret it from many points of view? The next one is, can they apply it? Again, that's kind of the transfer concept of education. One of you wrote in a blog, rather a discussion post, that you felt sort of an aha moment that your job is even beyond them understanding the content to, can they then transfer it to another context? It's a little harder for a kindergarten kid or to have that, play out. It's a lot easier with an older kid though. So even if they don't assess well on a traditional test or quiz, can they still transfer that knowledge? And face it, that's what a good, successful human being is able to do. We talk all the time about how the jobs we're training kids for right now won't even exist. Many won't exist in 10 or 20 years. You're starting a 5 or 6 or 7-year-old and teaching them the job that they're going to have at 18 it hasn't even been invented yet, perhaps. So what we're teaching them is the ability to transfer those skills. and obviously, if you're teaching early literacy, reading, writing, math, I mean those are skills that are just definitely important. But as we get older, skills like well, writing is a big piece. I tell you, more fields require strong writers than ever before. But also, people, you've heard the term, they can think critically. Or in some cases, we want students to be able to be flexible and have resilience, those soft skills, the habits of mind. So remember, those skills are universal and will probably be universal for the next century, at least, if not more. So explain, interpret, apply. These two are similar, perspective and empathy. Perspective is sort of the ability to see an issue from different points of view, where empathy is sort of deeper. It's like, can you walk in their shoes? So if you were, I've seen this happen in classrooms where students have dressed up as a slave and they've been able to act out what it felt like, for instance, to be emancipated, and how the feeling of freedom, even though they might have been indentured servants at the end of that, that feeling of freedom was just amazing. So can a student empathize with a character from 1865 or 1870? And then self-knowledge is more, do I know my own skill set? Because we're not all perfect. We don't have equal skills and equal knowledge. But do I know myself as a learner, how I learn best, not just what I know, but how I learn? So those are the 6 facets, a big piece of assessment a la UBD. This chart is kind of neat too, because it looks at 2 different approaches. The one on the left is really thinking like an assessor. This kind of sums up formative assessment, really, because assessment, as you know, is not just the quiz or the test or the benchmark or the RTI type of assessment or NEWA or DIBELS or any of those things. Those aren't really formative. I mean, they can be used formatively. So if you get a DIBELS test back and you find something specific in the area of phonics or vocabulary that a student just isn't getting, that's formative, right? But the type of formative we're mostly talking about is, as you go through the day, are you thinking like an assessor? So as a student is performing in class, are you thinking, are they understanding this? As opposed to, frankly, I like looking at myself here, back in the 80s when I started teaching, I don't know if I mean, intuitively, I might have been able to figure out that a student was learning or not learning what I was teaching, but I'm not sure I was all that concerned at the time. I might have been concerned at the end. I was concerned at the end, obviously, or maybe at the end of a week or the end of a unit. So when you think like an assessor, you're kind of wearing that hat all the time. And you do things like one of my favorite formative assessments. It's quick and simple. Is Fist or Five. So you get done with a concept and you say, "All right, guys, if you really understand it, give me 5. If you really don't understand it, give me a fist," and then fingers in between. And if you don't have a classroom that has a solved community yet, you can say, "All right, if you're going to do this, guys, just put the fist up against your chest." And I'll look, and you give me the fingers or the full hand, hopefully, right? So that, if you think like an assessor, that's what it is. So real quick, what would be sufficient and revealing evidence of understanding? That's how an assessor thinks. If you're an activity designer, meaning, you're in the business to make learning fun, to make it engaging, all good things, but it's not totally thinking like an assessor. So what you're thinking about is, how can I get great activities? So this right-hand side doesn't mean you don't do these things, but it's not enough to be a good assessor, to do formative assessment in the right way. Assessor figures out performance tasks where the activity designer just looks at, do I have my resources and materials ready for me? You can see the person on the left, the teacher on the left, is just thinking deeper. And in turn, whether you look at Hattie's effect sizes or whatever, you're going to have definitely greater academic achievement. How can I distinguish between those who really don't understand and those who do? You're always thinking that. Where, on the right-hand side here, activity designer just thinks about what assignments am I going to give them, as opposed to true understanding. I would rather, as your colleague and mentor, I would rather you not give homework if that's going to keep you from being a good assessor. homework is overrated, no doubt about it. It's not unnecessary, but if it keeps you from being a good assessor and thinking like an assessor, then it's not good. What's the criteria that I'm going to distinguish work? How am I going to know if a piece of writing is really good? That's what an assessor thinks about. And then, of course, the activity designer is thinking, oh my gosh, what do I give them for a grade? Is it a C plus? Is it a B minus? And I know that sometimes we have to give grades. That's just something our school requires. But how deep is that grade? What is the criteria? As the old joke goes, are you taking papers and throwing them down the stairs? And the ones at the bottom of the stairs are D's and F's, and the ones that don't fly as far are A's and B's. I mean, what is your criteria? Hopefully it's better than that. And the last one is, are there misunderstandings? If you think like an assessor, you're always thinking that. And then the activity designer thinks, did those activities work? And what does work mean? Did they have fun? Were they engaged? Again, important stuff. But you can get these things on the right and the things on the left together if you think like an assessor. And then this piece here is just, I'll skip by real fast. I just put it in because it is a lesson plan. I'll make it a little bit bigger here. No, it's not getting bigger. It's the lesson plan here for a good nutrition unit. So all this is assessment, but it's kind of broken down. So in the UBD format, you're going to think performance tasks or projects. The second one is more typical ones, quizzes, tests, academic prompts, and then other evidence like self-assessment and informal observations, that sort of thing. All right. One of the discussion posts that's already on Canvas is it's a simple thing. Think of a formative assessment you used with a student this year. Describe your technique and what you learned from the assessment. And so if I go into Canvas, which I can do here, I think, and go into discussions, one I've gotten up there is this one here, formative assessment this year. So I put the example I put in there for you. And by the way, this was originally going to be a shared Google Doc during class, but we didn't get to it. It's the unit on Greek culture and history, that little bell ringer activity we talked about last time. So that would be one of your discussion posts. So let's get into a little bit of formative assessment. Again, we're going to spend probably the month from now until mid-March dealing with it. It's a huge topic. It is bigger than probably anything we'll talk about this term. I like this little metaphor here. Formative assessment is when the chef tastes the soup, but summative assessment is when the guests taste the soup. And that reminds me of artists, athletes. They have, whether they knew it or not, been engaging in formative and summative assessment forever. So for football team, for instance, and take the Patriots, Bill Belichick is a formative assessor all the time. He thinks like an assessor constantly. He's looking at how well his players are blocking, how well his quarterbacks are throwing the ball, if people are, like the receivers, are they doing the right patterns? He's looking at that all the time, as well as his other coaches. He has many coaches. What's the summative assessment? Well, it's the game. It's Sunday at 1:00 is where the rubber meets the road. The summative assessment actually happens. And if they win, well, maybe they assessed well during the week and they corrected things based on their formative assessment so that they were the best team possible on Sunday. I think the same thing with artists or say musicians. If you're Bruce Springsteen, although he probably doesn't practice all that much anymore, but when he was younger, he probably practiced, guitar, songwriting, singing, performing. My God, he's a very physical musician, so he probably worked out a lot. I think he probably still does. That's, all formative. And he probably had coaches, like a coach perhaps to help him with that, or his agent or people like that. They were thinking like assessors, and they did the formative assessment. The concert's the summative thing. An artist is the same sort of thing, like a visual artist. The quote on the right is kind of cool. The real goal of classroom assessment is to improve student performance, not merely audit it. Reminds me of a quote from Grant Wiggins when he was especially talking about over-assessment. And he said, you don't fatten the calf by weighing it. Again, you don't fatten the calf by weighing it. Put whatever animal you want in that. But the point is, if you are a livestock person, just by weighing something is not going to make them any fatter, not going to make them any better. If I'm trying to lose weight and I weigh myself on Monday morning, I'm not going to lose weight any better because I weighed myself. Now, I do need to assess that because then I'll know if I'm doing the right things, if I'm following the diet that I need to be following. So it's important to know that just because you assess doesn't mean life is going to get better. You do need to assess, but we also need to talk at some point about over-assessment. I know you think about that a lot because assessment takes time. It takes instructional time away from kids. There's a price to pay for it. And it takes your own time away as well. Here's a chart that I kind of like that is kind of classroom assessment. By the way, you're going to see this term classroom assessment. It really means formative assessment. Obviously, lots of assessments take place in the classroom, but when you see this, and you'll see this from an article by Dylan William too, classroom assessment, he uses that term. He's referring to formative assessment. So there's really four big bubbles here. One is, why assess? What's the purpose? I mean, you don't assess just because someone tells you should assess, right? And then you got to think about, well, what are you going to assess? What are the learning targets? Are they clear and good? And then the design part. How are you going to do it? What method are you going to use? How are you going to sample? How are you going to avoid bias? Then once it's all done, then you communicate it. So it's really four big steps. How do you manage the information? How are you going to report it? Who are you going to report it to? Do parents see it? Do kids see it? Do you see it? Or in the case of the bigger assessments, which we'll talk about later in the semester, goes to the state, might even be in the newspapers. Not you as an individual teacher, but your school might be. That seems to be less of an issue these days too. And you could check out the extra arrows here on this chart. A couple quotes that are kind of cool from the article you're going to be reading this week and next from Black and William from way back in '98. We'll talk about it in a second. It really was a trendsetter sort of article. Encompassing all these activities undertaken by teachers and or by their students, provide information abuses feedback to modify the teaching and learning activities in which they are engaged. That's Dylan and Black's, or I should say William and Black's formative assessment definition. Summative assessment defined, these are done at a given moment in time to evaluate what has been learned and not learned. These are part of the accountability for the system or at the classroom level when involved with grading and reporting. I would argue that both these things are given at a particular moment in time. Usually summative assessments are at the end of a unit. Or, if you're talking DIBELS or you're talking NEWA, it's on a schedule, probably quarterly or 3 times in a year. Where formative assessment is meant to be natural, less formal, but still you keep track of it. There may be numbers and maybe qualitative. We've talked about qualitative versus quantitative. Quantitative, obviously, are those numbers you get out of an assessment. Qualitative might be an observation. A great formative assessment would be anecdotal note-taking, which I think you have to do at some point anyway, in addition to anything that's a little more standardized. Even the Pfister 5 thing I was showing you before is, quantitative, right? You're looking at 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You're probably not writing it down, but, hopefully in your brain you're figuring out, oh, Johnny really didn't get that concept. I either got to reteach that now or later, which brings up another issue. I can keep on going with these issues. But if you're doing a formative assessment, you find that, 80% of your class isn't getting it, then you probably need to reteach it. You need to stop and say, hey, it's not working. Once you're at 80%, though, competency for that particular skill or standard as shown by a formative assessment, then I think you can move on, but then you got to find a time to reteach. And whether you use an RTI model like win time or something, I'm not sure, but if you're at 80%, it's a pretty good mark, 75, 80%, then you move on with the class. But you got to make sure you get the other kids to catch up. All right, just some other assessment strategies. I'll let you read this, and I'll get another drink of water. I have to be honest with you, I did this whole thing already once, and I didn't turn my mic on. So that's one reason why I'm hoarse. I also spent the morning in Derry, actually, working with some kids, middle school kids. They were great. I did some videotaping of them and some of their climate and culture projects. So my voice is pretty much shot at 7:45 on Thursday. So, all right. So you've read that. I think the one that I want to emphasize is the last bullet there, checkbox. Activating students as owners of their own learning. One thing that John Hattie's people said Monday over and over again, and these are things we know, but it's good to have them kind of in our face, and that is our goal is not to teach kids so that they are tied to us forever. Especially elementary teachers, as someone who's been an elementary guy for much of my career, you want kids to like you, right? And I see it with high school teachers too. You want teenagers to think you're cool. And that's fine. The problem, though, is you also don't want them dependent on you. You want to move kids on. And even a kindergarten kid's going to move on the next year. May see you in the hallway, may visit you once in a while. But your goal is to move them on and to get them less dependent on you and have them as students who own their own learning. Crazy important. A little bit more on formative versus summative assessment. I'll put these links in the modules. But Rick Wormerly has a great video on formative versus summative. Rick is kind of a middle school guy, but a good general assessment guy. The Bow and Hopkins school districts many years ago, I don't know, 05 maybe, at some point we went and we booked him, and we both experienced a day with Rick. He was really good. All right, so coming up on this, that's too much of me, ladies and gentlemen. There we go. I think if I hit this button, if I hit that there, it becomes me. You know what I'll do? I'll put this here, and I'll move me over here. So coming up, our focus, as I mentioned, will be formative assessment for a while. Be serious about APA and the Lit Review. This actually is supposed to say not APA, but AARP. Obviously, APA is part of the Lit Review, but that's not what I meant there. So get serious about that. Digital portfolio is always a piece. And in a minute, I'll tell you about the classic article from William and Black. One comment about digital portfolio I want to make sure you really understand, guys, and that is don't work too hard to make it pretty. If you like making it pretty and it's what I call hobby time, go for it. That's fine. But I don't believe the appearance of it is going to be part of the grade. Make it useful, make it something that you can use in the future, but be sure you don't spend too much time on the things that aren't important, because God knows we don't have enough time for that. Obviously, find some peace next week. That's very important. I want to say happy vacation. You deserve it. I may take a day or two the following week because my wife will be home then. I'm not sure what we'll do, but sometimes getting out of Dodge is so important. Even if you're just kind of laying around a hotel room or just, and you're not going to be on a beach, obviously, but you don't have to spend a lot of money to refresh your brain. And try to dial back the digital piece as well if you can, because you know why. It can envelop your mind. If you'd like me to review any step along the way in the Lit Review, I enjoy that. I'll look for content as well as language use, so feel free to email me that too. So I wanted to make this a little bit of a, let me try to zoom this a little bit. That's too much. We'll go to 75. That's good. There is a piece I'd like you to focus on. It's a lengthy article. It's not too bad. I think they made it into a small book, but I don't know why. It's like 14 pages, something like that. It's called Inside the Black Box. And I wanted to introduce it a little bit. It's going to be your discussion post. And I'd like you to put maybe a little more time into this. It's more than a chapter in a book. It's a little bit more content, and it's certainly probably more important. And it's partly from Dylan William, and you, of course, recognize him from the book you're reading. And I think a lot of you like him better than Popham from your discussion posts, and I understand why. Dylan is much more classroom-based, where I think Popham is a little more of a broader thinker, more of a professor-y type of guy, even though William is also a higher ed guy. So back in 98, William and Black wrote this article called Inside the Black Box. And the purpose of the article really wasn't really written as much for you or me. And of course, 98 was, it was like 2.5 decades ago. But this article probably was one of the first to deal with formative assessment, or as he called it at the time, classroom assessment. It just wasn't something that we talked about much. Again, assessment was taking tests, or big tests, small tests, quizzes, those sort of things. So the other thing to keep in mind for this is that William and Black wrote it really for the government of England. These two dudes are English. And so there's some English references. There's reference to John Major, who was the past prime minister of Great Britain. But he's trying to get the point across that English schools are not doing well, and we need to focus more on classroom or formative assessment. And that was sort of an argument piece as you read through it. It's really well written. It's easy to read. And I've got 5 bullets there that, you don't have to obviously write on all of them, or, necessarily more than one. But I'd like you to put a little more time into this, because I think it's a really good article and capsulizes a lot of what we're talking about. And just real briefly, a couple things of these bullets. Has the piece stood the test of time? I think you're already seeing that it does. There may be a piece, though, that doesn't, and I'd like you to comment on that if you get a chance. Did you see yourself in it? And I'm seeing this in some of your discussion posts. In fact, it's common, and this is good for you guys and good for writers and thinkers, to try and obviously read whatever you read and immediately make it your own. And hopefully you're looking at your classroom and your own instructional practices whenever you're doing any of these assignments. And are there some persistent truths that remain in our field despite what time period we're in? And I put in quotes there, this is a transfer question. So just like for your students, I want you to be able to transfer, anything and all of what we're talking about, we're discussing, as I mentioned in the last class last night. That transfer is so important for all of us. I'm transferring all the time. And in my new consultant life, like I was in a school this morning, middle school, I was starting to transfer lots of things that either I remembered from way back when I taught middle school, or even when I was a principal, but it has new meaning now for me. So you keep on learning no matter what stage you're at. I think that's it. Just the last slide is my contact information. You're welcome to email me, call, text, whatever. I'm on Twitter even if you want to direct message me. So that's about it. Have a great week. Find some peace over vacation. Be sure you just get away for at least a little bit. Rest that brain of yours so you're ready to go back and fight the good fight when you come back to work. So take care, and I'll talk to you soon. Thanks.